Owen in the Agnon is a tremendous YouTube channel with some of the best scholarship around. And Owen reads books that nobody else reads, and there is wisdom to be found in those books that we really need today, without which I'm not sure if we're going to be able to address the problems that face us, outlined in, say, Belonging Again, alluded to by, say, the meta-crisis of Smackenberg, meaning crisis. The work that Owen is doing is essential for us to take on our current moment. His book, Defensology, is magnificent, and you should pick up a copy today. You can find it on Amazon. Please leave a review. That makes a big difference. And Owen in this book is going to be talking about, the issue of human aggressivity. We can think of themos, which is, he also did a book on the studies of themos. He also has another piece, Notes from the Pod, which is fantastic. And one of the ways that we can think about what Owen is getting at is that there's an idea that themos, which is more than just human aggression. There's the need, social recognition, social structure, striving, aspiration. These things all come together. One of the things I think that has gotten us in trouble is that we simply don't have very nuanced or complicated understanding of human principles. We talk about anger and sadness, but something like themos is not reducible to a linear emotion like anger or sadness. It's combined together. It's anger and care and anxiety and drive and exhilaration. And then you have logos, rationality, defining clean lines, figuring, eros, desire, which can get to drive and seeking. And of course, all of those overlap and influence one another. But the idea is that if you don't have all three in harmony, you end up in a lot of trouble. Something that Owen talked about in a recent piece is that Plato, Socrates, they saw the role of the philosopher as always needing to be present in a society to make sure that there was a harmony between, say, themos, eros, and logos. And if there wasn't, the society would be in massive trouble. But of course, if, say, the society was dominated by eros and logos, logos would make it very difficult to think that there was anything wrong. Or what could themos do other than get us into conflict or war or lots of trouble? And so if the philosopher is not there to always bring about thinking that I would associate with non-rationality, then we're going to end up in Nash equilibria, in suboptimal results. Owen notes how for Plato there's a focus on the ruler, but not just because Plato only cares about the ruler, but because the ruler is the ideal fusion of different principles reflected in that social order. So if you get a clear understanding of the ruler, you can get an understanding of how the average citizen should be, how everyone should be. And what we see in a leader is this fusion of warlike courage and philosophic wisdom. And I think here we can understand why Owen will talk about his thinking as kind of a Platonic Nietzschean, which sounds impossible. But I think we have misread Plato, and I do think we've misread Nietzsche in different ways, and they can be brought together. And Owen points here at reasons why. We see in Plato this emphasis on how the only way to get the harmonious soul is if the individual brings together, the courage we see in war and philosophic wisdom. But today, to the mind, for the way we think today, that just basically seems impossible. But that's why the philosopher is so important, because they kind of continue to show you the way on how one can go around to find this harmonic potentiality, to use a phrase from the book. And we should note how much music metaphors are important in Plato, because we're dealing with a harmony which is unstable and it's moving. And, if we think, Hegel dialectic, everything is passing over into otherness. And so logos is passing over to eclipse. Themos and eros and everything is in conflict, and somehow we have to keep it together or the human will be replaced versus extended. And if in philosophy needs to really be focused on which of these essential principles of the human soul, not accidental, which here I'm just focusing on and representing it by logos, eros, and themos. Philosophy of every historic moment needs to ask the question, which of these are we deficient in? Which of these is most at risk of being eclipsed? And focused on bringing that back. Perhaps in a previous generation, like the time of the Enlightenment, there was a deficiency in logos. So most philosophy was logos-centric, or had a very logos quality to it. Perhaps there were societies where we were drunk on Puritanism and problematically ethical and kind of gnostically religious in a dangerous way. Thus, there was a need for a philosophy of eros. And I think today, basically, we need a philosophy of themos. And I think many people coming into philosophy on the liminal web come from a thematic background. And that makes sense if there's something about philosophy, which is the navigation of keeping these three together in harmony. And Owen asks, what disaster is at hand for those who are intellectually and commercially advanced, yet lack thematic energy and initiative? And that's what the meaning crisis. We're seeing it today. These terrible problems that we have, we can see as the disaster at hand for those who are logos and erosly advanced but lack themos. Owen will also talk about how, it came up in our conversation, is that I think nuclear deterrence is how we've dealt with themos. We basically said, well, themos has to be dealt with or we'll all die. But you see, threat, here's what's very important. Threat does not address themos. The only way to deal with themos is mastery. If you threat, just represses it. And that's going to lead to problems and pathologies and, a loss of motivation, a loss of drive. Exactly what we see. I think the meaning crisis is fundamentally a motivation crisis. And so the threat of nuclear weaponry or nuclear apocalypse, or the threat of going to jail, the threat of being outcast, is not an address of themos. And this is also a very important point. So to quote from the book, Plato understood that the same faculty of mind, themos, which is the psycho-ethical grounding for martial virtues, is also the regulatory force which deals with insatiable appetite. So if we think that everyone's consuming themselves to death, if we think the market is too much, if there's growth at the expense of the environment, if we think that there's pornography is destroying us, if we think that our desire and wants is leading to a pathological world, Plato would say, it's because you haven't addressed themos. You haven't learned to integrate it into your society. And themos regulates eros, and it also regulates logos, helps you avoid autonomous rationality, as I talk about. And so if you don't address themos, simply threaten it or try to contain it with nuclear deterrence, you'll have no regulatory force, and you're going to get a very problematic market. I think you're also going to, this would get into belonging again to one, you'll have the great stagnation, you'll have stimulation of demand, not the creation of demand, you won't have intrinsic motivation, all sorts of trouble. Owen writes, thus we see this fusion of courage and wisdom having a role in restraining the appetitive impulses. It is no wonder that in late capitalist consumer paradise, one that is now talking constantly of using new brain sciences to telepathically communicate pornographic moments or live without minimal discomfort or pain, new horizons of total pain avoidance, and techno-womb-like insulation, we could easily see the insistence on the negligent of manly virtues as an ideological choice rather than anything progressively inevitable. So the point is that we see the loss of it. We basically are defining themos and progress as, we tend to define progress as the loss of themos. If themos is essential for the human being, then that means we're defining progress by our self-effacement. And that's a big problem, because as that occurs, if logos and eros are in a conspiracy, quote unquote, against themos, in capital, as Marx talks about, as in AI, as Nick Land talks about, which is a continuation of the logic of capital, then part of what is conspiring against us is precisely the thinking and the logic that we seemingly to some degree need to be able to frame the problem of what we are suffering today as a self-effacement due to a deficiency of themos, to correct myself based on how Aspasia corrected me. So this is a major issue. And Owen's work is really, really pointing out how our challenge is to fuse together the elements of wisdom and courage necessary. And look, again, we can just see Plato as asking, how do we maintain a civilization that doesn't have the different dimensions of the soul come conflict or devour one another or be lost. So there's a civilising question at the heart of the Republic. It is in, then he'll talk later about the civilising project with, as all these different thinkers. But there's something about the question of the ordering of the soul, which is the ordering of the society. Many people have noted the Republic is, the structuring of the polis is like the structuring of the soul. Well, yes, that makes sense, because the role of the society is to make sure there's a harmony between themos, eros, and logos. And if today we're basically, over-indexing logos and eros against themos, then Plato and Socrates would be like, hey, that's not going to work. And there's a certain civilized arrogance, you could say, as to use this phrase from the book. It's very problematic. Owen will also talk about how, Ivan Illich once said that when pain becomes curable, it is unbearable, that a uncurable pain is more bearable. And I think one of the reasons for that is because a pain that can be cured is a technical problem, and it becomes irrational to bear it. Like, if you just choose to bear the pain, you're a fool, right? And so it becomes unbearable because, people will know you chose the pain, and why would you do that, and so on and so forth. Also, curable pain suggests that we're not vulnerable, that we have a godlike power. And Owen beautifully describes how there's some sort of revelation of humans' ontological power in our vulnerability, our ontological nakedness. And he goes through various myth stories, Prometheus, and so on and so forth, to really show how it is in the vulnerability that human beings rise to the occasion to see what they're made of. And if they're denied that vulnerability, then they actually don't develop very well at all. It is this initial forgetfulness, nakedness, and exposure to the risk of being torn apart and overwhelmed that lays the groundwork for the ontological heights that we see when man uses fire. And there is something about fire we can associate with technology, but when we use our tools to extend our humanity versus destroy our humanity, it tends to be from a place of vulnerability, from a place of nakedness. Owen has also talked about how there's something actually perverse about the warrior who goes on the battlefield with too much armor. There's a certain sort of lack of themos in that, a great warrior is lightly armored, because armor is kind of making up for your lack of skill. And so there's something about, it is precisely our vulnerability that drives us to master fire and to use technology, which then leads to our godlike power. But then unfortunately, we can use that very godlike power that emerged from vulnerability to get rid of our vulnerability, which seems like an advance, but there's something about the experience of vulnerability itself, which is necessary for humans to rise to great heights. And if they don't have that experience, you could call it, the walking through Inferno in Dante, necessary to get to the Paradiso, the facing of the real in Lacan. If we don't have that negativity, we're just not, we don't function. We tend to devolve in very problematic ways. And I think it's fascinating the way Owen lays out how we see this theme of vulnerability, ontological nakedness at the heart of so many myths in the past. He'll talk much about Nietzsche. He talks about Christianity, and he talks about also a beautiful idea that you have in Zarathustra of entering houses, is the idea that many of the houses today are kind of like toy houses, doll houses, and you have to stoop to enter them. And there's this theme of everyone today is a doll, domestication. Owen will talk about Sloterdijk. And there's something where domestication is now a manifestation of the conspiracy of eros and logos against thymos. There's a way in which we're supposed to be not too loud. We are supposed to be thymotic. We're supposed to be safe from nature. And he also, Owen is a great scholar on the work of Fukuyama, and he talks about the last chapter, the end of the book, The End of History and The Last Man, and when he talks about how Fukuyama sees, he sees kind of a tragic problem with the problem of themos, and he sees, how in the world are we going to scratch this need that humans need for recognition and status? And he's like, maybe the market can provide it, but unfortunately that doesn't seem to be the case, and to the degree it does, it can select for sociopathy, the dark triad, as some people say, and also seems to be a winner-take-all game, which is not particularly good for a social order. Owen will also talk about Hobbes, very interesting thoughts on Hobbes, I love Philip Reeve, and he talks about Philip Reeve. And I also really like this part where he talks about what ends up happening in a purely therapeutic society of releases and no givens. And there is something about logos and eros that wants to get rid of restraint and to be purely released. Well, we talk about this in Belonging again, part 1. When you have pure releases, you're psychologically overwhelmed and destroyed. And what ends up happening, you also get this kind of injunction to enjoy, as Zizek says, well, you must enjoy, you have to enjoy, or else there's a problem. You have to use your brain, you have to logos, you have to do eros, or else you're in trouble. And what I really like how Owen wrote this, so there's this irony where, so he says, cultures of purely therapeutic innovation have developed numerous ways of providing what Reeve called release from super-egoic tensions, so these kind of authoritarian things. Yet it has created its own super-ego out of its own project, the injunction to enjoy, we could say with Zizek. It has created a therapeutic super-ego, which is paradoxical considering the point of therapy is to provide space or relief from the super-ego. By turning the space outside the pressure of the super-ego into its own super-ego, we reach the limits of the therapeutic culture. It means that effective therapeutics will have to contradict the very definition it was founded on. So this whole idea of release, then you're not released from the injunction to release. And so there's a certain irony that occurs there that leads to all sorts of dysfunction. And this key idea here, there's sometimes a notion that repression is, if you moralize it, you might start saying repression is always bad, we shouldn't be repressed, but maybe you come around like an older conservative and say that repression is good. But then the question is, why is repression good? And I think this is beautiful, what Owen wrote. As the Nietzschean task to move beyond good and evil necessitates, we see again here that we must not simply accept repression because it emerged as a functional good that stops us killing each other, but because of an intrinsic good which has substantial reasons to exist. There is something about repression, when done in the right way, is actually the very training and mastery of thymos. So repression, if we're not careful, and we over-demonize it, then there's no way, there's no way to deal with thymos other than threat, and that's not to do it. So if we overly demonize repression, and we have to ask what kind of repression are we talking, but if we're not careful, then you're not going to have thymos. You're going to be in trouble. And then at that point, I don't think you can sublimate desire to drive. You can't get intrinsic motivation, at which point I think we're in massive trouble. Nietzsche, Owen does amazing work on the Guardian class in Plato. This was an excellent chapter, so I would suggest that. The heroic psychology, I like what his reflections on the rage of Achilles. This is fascinating. Just the scholarship of Owen is remarkable, and the work he does on classical myths and texts that are forgotten, I think, often is just something else, really something. I also like, he talks about the phenomenology of abandonment. Sloterdijk talks on Sloterdijk. There's the idea, a line, becoming an adult means preparing for the death of those nearest to us, movement for the mother, you move away from the mother. There's something about abandonment that is really necessary for maturity and facing abandonment and what to do about abandonment and how do we relate to abandonment. And I think you see what ends up happening is that fear is something you face, right? If you don't, then you view it as a technical problem to get rid of, and you figure out how we never have to abandon one another. Maybe you create cell phones where there's always social networks and we're never alone, right? Which ironically means we're always alone. Then maybe you use arrows to always feel good, so you never have to feel existential dread, right? So the idea of abandonment is fascinating. Joshua Hansen and Owen did a awesome class on Paul Virilio. Owen talks about Paul Virilio a lot. I think Virilio is necessary for our moment. If we don't think Virilio, we're not going to think now. And under Virilio, this is an amazing way that he ends a chapter. He says, everything becomes, so this is kind of, Virilio can be seen as a philosopher of speed. And we can say today that everything becomes overwhelming. Nothing becomes coherent. We are a civilization of headless chickens who scare each other with constant streams of terrifying images. And when the heroic emerges, he is the first to be sent to the slaughterhouse. That's very powerful, because in this confusion, we can't really recognize good themos from threatening themos, or the heroic from the dangerous, and so we just get rid of it entirely. And so this speed, this constant disorientation leads to a very nervous logos and eros that doesn't even give themos the time of day. It doesn't give any of these practices we need to master ourselves any consideration. And why master ourselves? We can just take a pill, right? And on that, Owen will talk about medical nemesis with Ivan Illich. The beloved and extraordinary Ivan Illich is an important thinker here. Again, Owen will talk about thinkers I associate with the modern counter-enlightenment that are overlooked. I think that's really important. And I think also I like, and I've this point that has come out with Owen on the need for a psychoanalysis of anger, a kind of psychoanalysis of themos. We have one that is mostly eros and desire based, but we really need to start thinking about a psychoanalysis that takes seriously anger. He has a great analysis of the movie The Northman. That's really great. That was a good movie. He talks about auto-aggressivity, which I think is important. How aggression is really, really something we have to take seriously if we're going to do civilization, but we've tended to respond to that with the anesthesiotic society, a societies of anesthesia to make everything comfortable so we don't have to feel pain. But if we don't feel pain, we can't master ourselves. I have hardly touched on this book. It is incredible. Do pick up a copy. He'll talk about the end of, I like the conclusion. I think the conclusion leaves us with a project, and I've hardly touched on anything. There's so much in this great book. But the conclusion, the subtitle, The End of Liberality as a Psychospatial Revolt. It's a fascinating approach to the philosophy of space, the phenomenology of space. I think space is really important. I know Daniel Zaruba and Michelle had a talk on space. I'm very interested by that. I've been thinking more about eros with objects, logos with walls, themos with horizons. This comes out in the conversation I had with Owen about the book. But for more by Owen, do check out Owen in the Agon. Please check out his videos. He's got a great series on Clausewitz, on war. He's got a great series on Fukuyama. My goodness, just check out all his series. I love Schizo FM that he does with the great Samuel Barnes. Very insightful, very interesting, and I suggest you pick up a copy of Defensology today. You can find it on Amazon. Please leave a review, and thank you so much for your time.